My name is Camille, and I am in my early 70s. I built my life with sharp intellect and fierce independence, rising from humble beginnings to become a successful businesswoman, a loving matriarch who took pride in providing for those I cherished most. My family, my carefully accumulated wealth, these were my legacy, the testament to decades of hard work and sacrifice. But now, in the twilight of my years, my very identity has become a terrifying lie, and I am drowning in a reality I no longer recognize. I dedicated my entire adult life to providing for my son's future, nurturing him with the kind of devotion only a mother understands, building my wealth through years of careful planning and diligent work to ensure our family's security would never be questioned. I trusted him and his wife, implicitly believing, with the naive confidence of unconditional love, that my well-being was safe in their hands, never imagining that betrayal could wear such a familiar, beloved face. But then a mild stroke stole crucial pieces of my memory, leaving me vulnerable and suggestible in ways I had never experienced before. They seized this moment of weakness like predators who had been waiting in the shadows. My son and his wife meticulously constructed an entirely false life around me, hiring skilled actors to play my dearest friends, fabricating elaborate stories of a past riddled with debts and obligations that never existed. My entire history was being rewritten before my eyes, my assets systematically stolen. My reality dissolved into a terrifying psychological prison where I could no longer trust my own mind. Yet beneath the suffocating fog of confusion, defiant flashes of truth pierced through like lightning in a storm. The unique, intoxicating scent of my beloved gardenia bush that had grown outside my real bedroom window. A specific architectural detail from my actual home that no amount of deception could replicate. The warmth of a true friend's hand, a touch that carried decades of genuine affection that no imposter could ever duplicate. These sensory anchors whispered of a stolen past I knew I had to reclaim, even if the search led me deeper into the chilling abyss of their calculated deceit. My home, which had once been the solid foundation of my identity and the sanctuary where I had planned to spend my golden years in peace, had become nothing more than an elaborate stage for their cruel, theatrical performance. Every morning brought a fresh wave of disorientation that crashed over me like a cold tide, leaving me gasping for air and grasping for something solid to hold onto in a world that seemed to shift beneath my feet. The layout of the house felt subtly wrong in ways I couldn't articulate, like a familiar song played in the wrong key. Doorways appeared where I didn't expect them. Hallways seemed shorter or longer than my muscle memory insisted they should be, and the morning light fell through windows at angles that made my soul ache with inexplicable sadness. The stroke had left my mind feeling like a sieve, with words and memories escaping me like smoke through my fingers, and this devastating vulnerability had become their greatest opportunity. Every carefully built pillar of my life was crumbling piece by agonizing piece, being systematically replaced by a meticulously crafted illusion that felt as substantial as morning mist. The woman I had been for 7 decades, the sharp-minded businesswoman who had built an empire through wit and determination, was being slowly erased and replaced by a confused, helpless creature who couldn't trust her own perceptions. My son and his wife moved through this fabricated existence with a chilling composure that made my skin crawl, though I couldn't quite understand why their presence filled me with such unease. Their smiles were perfectly calibrated, neither too bright nor too subdued, and their voices carried a soothingly patronizing tone that reminded me of how adults speak to very small children who can't be trusted to understand complex situations. Any attempt I made to question even the smallest detail, to grasp at fleeting memories of what I desperately hoped was my true past, was met with practiced deflection that had clearly been rehearsed countless times. They would seamlessly change the subject with the skill of professional performers, or swiftly introduce another friend into the conversation, another hired actor, whose job it was to reinforce whatever narrative they were currently spinning about my supposedly troubled history. When I hesitantly mentioned that I didn't remember owing money to a particular visitor, my daughter-in-law would gently pat my hand and say with false sympathy, "Oh, mother, you know how your memory has been since the stroke." Dr. Peterson explained that these episodes of confusion are perfectly normal. When I questioned why certain family photographs looked unfamiliar, my son would sigh with what appeared to be loving patience and explain that the stroke had affected my ability to recognize faces in pictures. Their systematic obstruction ensured my complete isolation from any source of truth or validation, solidifying the terrifying feeling that my genuine past was being systematically erased, with no one left in the world to truly see me for who I really was. They had created a bubble around me, so complete, so carefully constructed, that any reality beyond their manufactured version seemed increasingly impossible to access or prove. I found myself grappling with the most fundamental existential question a human being can face. Who am I? The stories they told me of my life felt rehearsed and hollow, completely devoid of the rich emotional tapestry that should have accompanied my own experiences. When they spoke of events I had supposedly lived through, travels I had supposedly taken, people I had supposedly known intimately, I felt nothing but a cold emptiness where warm recognition should have bloomed. I would search desperately for familiar emotions, for genuine connections reflected in their eyes when they looked at me, but found only practiced empathy that felt as artificial as plastic flowers. There was a chilling emptiness behind their caring expressions, a performance so polished it almost fooled even me, but not quite. My mind, though clouded by the after effects of the stroke, rebelled against the imposed reality with the stubbornness of truth refusing to be buried. The inability to articulate these discrepancies, to explain why everything felt wrong when it appeared so right on the surface, intensified my confusion and self-doubt, until I feared I was losing my grip on sanity itself. Was I truly becoming the confused, unreliable old woman they painted me as, or was my reality genuinely this horrifying maze of lies and manipulation designed to drive me mad? Their words became a constant, insidious hum in the background of my existence, designed to erode my sanity, one drop at a time, like water, slowly wearing away stone. "Mom, you always had such a terrible memory for names." My son would sigh with apparent affection when I hesitated over the identity of an old friend whose face triggered no recognition whatsoever in my mind. "Don't you remember, Mother? You owed him quite a lot of money from that unfortunate business venture," my daughter-in-law would insist with gentle firmness when a hired creditor would visit to discuss debts I had no memory of incurring. "That's just your imagination playing tricks on you again, sweetheart. We know your real history, and we're here to help you navigate through this difficult time." The most chilling remarks were those that hinted my past was somehow shameful or problematic, filled with poor decisions and financial mistakes that justified their current help in managing my affairs. They made me believe I should feel grateful that they were willing to take care of everything for me, that without their intervention, I would be lost in a world too complex for my damaged mind to navigate safely. Their relentless psychological manipulation was a form of torture so subtle and sophisticated that I began to question my own perceptions, my own memories, my own worth as a human being. I was caught in their web of lies so completely that I truly feared for my sanity, wondering if the woman I remembered being had ever really existed at all. Yet deep within the suffocating fog of confusion and doubt, a stubborn core of authentic self persisted like an ember that refused to be extinguished. Fleeting, visceral sensory experiences would pierce through the manufactured reality like arrows of truth, bringing with them fragments of something real and undeniable. The unique, earthy sweetness of gardenias would suddenly fill my nostrils, though no such flowers grew anywhere near this house that was supposedly my home. The specific worn texture of an embroidered pillow that my fingers remembered stroking thousands of times would surface in my tactile memory, though no such pillow existed in this carefully curated environment. A fragment of a half-forgotten song would swell within my heart with genuine emotion, unlike the bland, generic music they played to supposedly calm my agitated nerves. These weren't coherent memories I could describe or defend in any logical way, but they were powerful, unsettling, sensory anchors that connected me to something authentic beyond their fabricated world. Most precious of all was an old ornate locket. I had always worn a seemingly innocuous piece of jewelry that had somehow escaped their systematic removal of my personal possessions. Unbeknownst to them, this locket contained a tiny, faded photograph of the real sweeping view from my original bedroom window, a vista that had greeted me every morning for decades before this nightmare began. It became my secret anchoring point, a silent internal affirmation that my authentic self had indeed existed, that I wasn't entirely lost to their cruel deception, and that somewhere beyond their carefully constructed walls, my true reality was waiting to be reclaimed. One particularly unsettling afternoon, while a group of supposed old friends were loudly recounting what they claimed were cherished memories of our shared adventures, a specific detail struck me like a physical blow to my consciousness. These hired actors who performed their roles with the enthusiasm of people being paid well for their deception were describing in vivid detail a Caribbean cruise I had supposedly taken with them several years before my stroke. They painted elaborate pictures of azure waters and tropical sunsets, of steel drum music and fruity drinks with little umbrellas, speaking with the kind of manufactured nostalgia that suggested they had studied brochures rather than lived experiences. But as they spoke, a flash of genuine memory surfaced from somewhere deep within my fractured consciousness, rising through the confusion like a bubble breaking the surface of murky water. I remembered with sudden crystalline clarity the distinct salty tang of the Atlantic Ocean, not the warm Caribbean they described. I could feel the specific chill of the New England coast that had always made me pull my sweater closer, could see the rocky, weathered shore where I had actually vacationed every summer for 20 years. The cottage with its weathered shingles, the lighthouse that guided ships safely to harbor, the local fisherman who always waved from his boat. These were real memories with the weight and texture of lived experience. It was such a small detail in the grand scheme of their elaborate deception, something that could easily be dismissed as the confused ramblings of a stroke victim whose memory was unreliable at best. But to me, it was a raw tear in the fabric of their meticulously constructed lie, sending a prickle of cold awareness through my entire body like an electric shock that awakened something that had been sleeping. This jarring discrepancy, combined with subtle observations I had been making about how the imposters interacted with each other began to paint a picture that chilled me to the bone. There was something rehearsed about their conversations, a quality that reminded me of actors who had learned their lines but hadn't quite mastered the art of making them sound natural and spontaneous. My son's constant anxiety whenever I deviated from their expected script became more apparent to me, the way his jaw would tighten and his eyes would dart nervously to his wife whenever I asked questions that strayed too far from their prepared narrative. The way all these friends seemed to know exactly the same stories about me, told in remarkably similar language, as if they had all been briefed from the same instruction manual. These details began to imply a horrifying truth that my mind initially rejected as too monstrous to be real. This wasn't simply confusion resulting from my stroke, the natural disorientation that might follow a medical trauma. This was something far more sinister and deliberate, an elaborate, carefully orchestrated charade designed to completely rewrite my existence. My entire life was being systematically reconstructed, my authentic memories replaced with fabricated ones that served someone else's purposes, and the friends I was supposed to recognize and trust were nothing more than skilled actors hired to perpetuate a cruel deception that went beyond anything I could have imagined possible. As these realizations began to crystallize in my mind, I found myself remembering my daughter-in-law's behavior in the months leading up to my stroke details that had seemed innocent or merely helpful at the time, but now took on a chilling new significance. Her intense, almost predatory interest in my financial affairs had been constant, though I had interpreted it as the natural concern of a family member who wanted to help manage complex matters. Her casual questions about my will, asked during what I thought were ordinary family dinners, now seemed calculated and purposeful. Her subtle suggestions that I should simplify my accounts, consolidate my investments, make things easier for everyone to manage. These conversations that I had thought demonstrated her caring nature now felt like the careful probing of someone conducting reconnaissance for a planned assault. Had this elaborate deception, this complete rewrite of my very existence, been brewing for years, like a slow poison, waiting patiently for the perfect moment of vulnerability? The pieces of their avarice, once so subtle I had dismissed them as normal family dynamics, now began to connect into a horrifying picture of premeditated theft, not just of my money and property, but of my identity, my history, my very sense of self, the realization that I might have been living with people who were planning to destroy me, people who saw my love and trust as weaknesses to be exploited, was almost too devastating to process. How long had they been watching and waiting? How many of our family moments had been tainted by their secret planning? How many times had they smiled at me while calculating how to steal everything I had worked my entire life to build? Several days after the jarring memory about my real vacation experiences during what they called a family dinner, designed to reinforce our supposed happy relationships, I decided to test their reactions with a careful experiment. The dining room felt wrong, like every other room in this house that was supposedly my home, but I forced myself to focus on the conversation rather than the unsettling wrongness of my surroundings. I keep thinking about those summer vacations, I said as casually as I could manage, watching their faces carefully for any telltale reactions. I can still smell the pine trees and feel that cool New England breeze, not salty ocean air like you mentioned. The change in the atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. My daughter-in-law's laughter, which had been flowing freely just moments before, died instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. Her eyes, usually so carefully composed and warm, flashed with something raw and dangerous, a combination of fear and fury that she couldn't quite hide behind her practiced mask. "Mom, what are you talking about?" She snapped, her voice sharp and defensive, before she caught herself and quickly attempted to recover with a strained smile that looked more like a grimace. "You've always loved the ocean. Don't you remember how you used to talk about the beautiful sunsets over the water?" But I had seen the truth in that unguarded moment, the panic that flickered across her features like lightning illuminating a dark landscape. Her uncharacteristic agitation, the way she had immediately jumped to contradict me rather than gently redirect as she usually did, confirmed what my growing suspicions had been whispering. I was getting too close to exposing their fabricated reality, and they knew it. This small victory in my internal struggle for truth was both exhilarating and terrifying. It proved that my instincts were correct, that my fragmentary memories were real, but it also showed me how dangerous it might be to continue pushing against the boundaries of their deception. If they were willing to go to these elaborate lengths to control my reality, what might they do if they felt truly threatened by my growing awareness? The pieces of this horrible puzzle were still scattered and incomplete, like a jigsaw with most of the pieces missing, but the weight of this partial knowledge was absolutely crushing. Each small revelation pressed down on me like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe or think clearly about what my next step should be. This emerging understanding confirmed my most chilling suspicion. My entire existence had become a carefully orchestrated performance in which I was simultaneously the lead character and the unwitting victim. Every day, every conversation, every supposed act of caring was part of an elaborate script designed to keep me docile and compliant while they systematically stripped away everything that had ever belonged to me. This wasn't the closure or relief that comes from solving a mystery. It was the disturbing confirmation of a psychological assault so sophisticated and complete that it challenged my understanding of what human beings were capable of doing to each other. Yet I still lacked the kind of coherent, undeniable proof that would allow me to take meaningful action or any clear means to fight back without them simply doubling down on their gaslighting until I truly did lose my mind. The unease that had been growing inside me like a tumor intensified into a constant thrumming anxiety that lived beneath my skin and colored every interaction with suspicion and dread. Rather than feeling empowered by my growing knowledge, I felt more anxious and heartbroken than ever, knowing the true depth of the deception I was facing while remaining helpless to escape it. I was living in a world where nothing was real, where the people who should have loved and protected me had become my captors and tormentors, where my own family had decided that my life and legacy were less important than their immediate desires for wealth and control. The isolation was complete and devastating, leaving me trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no awakening. Driven by a desperate, agonizing need to reclaim some sense of who I truly was, to salvage whatever fragments of my authentic self might still exist beneath their layers of deception, I began conducting a subtle but systematic internal investigation that became my secret mission and the only thing that gave my days any sense of purpose. I would carefully test the hired imposters who claimed to be my dearest friends, asking seemingly innocent questions about shared memories they claimed we had created together over decades of supposed friendship. I became a detective in my own life, studying their responses with the focus of someone whose very sanity depended on distinguishing truth from elaborate fiction. The differences between their rehearsed answers and the fleeting visceral truths that still resonated deep within my damaged, but persistent consciousness, became my roadmap through the maze of lies they had constructed around me. My mind, though fragile and unreliable in many ways, became sharper and more focused in this one crucial area, transformed by desperation into an instrument capable of detecting the subtle inconsistencies in their performance. I was searching for undeniable proof of the deception evidence that would be convincing even to my own doubt-ridden mind, something that would validate the nightmare I suspected was unfolding around me and help me begin the seemingly impossible task of reclaiming fragments of my stolen identity. Every small victory, every moment when I caught them in a contradiction or noticed a detail that didn't align with their story, felt like finding a piece of solid ground in an earthquake. Through weeks of careful observation and analysis, paying attention to their careless remarks when they thought I wasn't listening or was too confused to understand the implications, a clearer and infinitely more cruel motive began to emerge from the shadows of their deception like a monster rising from murky water. My son, the child I had raised with such love and devotion, the person I had trusted above all others to protect my interests and honor my legacy, had accumulated massive financial debts that he and his wife had carefully concealed from me. The magnitude of their financial troubles became apparent through overheard phone conversations conducted in hushed, urgent tones, through bills that arrived addressed to him but quickly disappeared through the stressed expressions they wore when they thought no one was watching. My extensive assets, the wealth I had spent a lifetime accumulating through careful planning and hard work, the legacy I had intended to pass down through generations, had become their ultimate target and the solution to all their problems. The elaborate fabrication of my past, the constant psychological manipulation designed to make me question my own perceptions, the systematic isolation from anyone who might validate my true memories. All of these cruel tactics were meticulously designed to accomplish one primary goal. They needed to control every aspect of my life to transform me from an independent woman capable of making her own decisions into a compliant puppet who would sign whatever documents they placed before her without question or resistance. They required undisputed access to my wealth, my property, my investments, everything I had worked so hard to build. And the only way to achieve this was to convince everyone, including me, that I was no longer mentally competent to manage my own affairs. It was a grand evil scheme driven by pure avarice and a profound lack of conscience that took my breath away with its calculated cruelty. They had looked at my love for them, my trust in their intentions, my vulnerability after the stroke, and seen nothing but opportunities to exploit for their own financial gain. The family bonds I had cherished, the relationships I had nurtured with such care, meant nothing to them compared to the money they could steal if they could just make me disappear as a person while keeping me alive as a source of wealth. As my subtle observations and growing awareness seemed to stir their unease, their tactics evolved and became more desperate, more aggressive in their attempts to maintain complete control over my reality and my perceptions. My genuine personal documents, letters from real friends, old photographs that might trigger authentic memories, even my favorite books that carried the comfort of familiar stories, began to mysteriously disappear from my room. When I asked about these missing items, I was told with patient condescension that I had never owned such things, that my memory was creating false images of possessions that had never existed. The systematic removal of these anchors to my true past was particularly devastating because each item had been a small lifeline to the person I really was, and watching them vanish felt like watching pieces of my soul being erased. They began subtly but effectively poisoning my reputation with anyone who attempted to contact me from my previous life, intercepting phone calls and messages to create a barrier between me and the outside world. When former colleagues or actual friends tried to reach out, they were told stories of my rapid cognitive decline and increasingly unstable behavior that made maintaining contact seem pointless or even harmful. These character assassinations served a dual purpose. They isolated me from potential sources of truth and validation, while simultaneously creating a narrative that would discredit anything I might say if I ever found the courage or opportunity to speak out about what was being done to me. Anyone who might have believed my claims of deception would be told I was a confused old woman whose mind could no longer be trusted. My son's casual jokes about my forgetfulness intensified until they became a constant drumbeat of psychological abuse designed to reinforce my vulnerability and dependence on their version of reality. "Oh, Mom, you know how you get confused about things," he would say with a patronizing chuckle whenever I questioned any aspect of their story. "We're so lucky Dr. Peterson explained how normal this kind of confusion is after a stroke." These comments served as constant reminders that in their narrative, I was the problem, the unreliable narrator of my own life, whose perceptions couldn't be trusted. They were tightening their insidious grip on my psyche while simultaneously eroding my very sense of self, making me doubt not just my memories, but my fundamental worth as a human being capable of independent thought and decision-making. The relentless psychological battle they were waging against my mind and spirit took a devastating toll on every aspect of my physical and emotional well-being. Sleep, which should have offered refuge from the daily assault on my reality, instead brought fractured dreams filled with images of a life I couldn't fully grasp, faces that shifted between true and false conversations that might have been real memories or manufactured fantasies. I would wake exhausted rather than refreshed, my body aching with a profound weariness that went far beyond physical fatigue. My appetite vanished completely as the stress of living in constant uncertainty and fear made the simple act of eating feel impossible. Food turned to ash in my mouth, and I began losing weight at an alarming rate, my clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to be disappearing along with my identity. My hands developed a persistent tremor that was caused not just by the lingering effects of the stroke, but by the constant internal terror of never knowing what was real and what was fabricated. The simplest tasks became monumental challenges when you couldn't trust your own perceptions or memories to guide you through familiar routines that had somehow become foreign and threatening. I felt utterly trapped in a web of lies so complex and complete that every struggle to free myself only seemed to entangle me more thoroughly. The weight of their combined depravity was crushing my spirit, grinding down the strong, independent woman I had always been until I feared there would be nothing left but an empty shell, living a fabricated life designed by others for their own purposes. This wasn't simply a pursuit of truth or justice anymore. It had become a desperate fight for my very soul against a level of cruelty so profound and sophisticated that it threatened to erase every trace of the authentic person I had spent 70 years becoming. They were systematically destroying not just my present and future, but my past as well, leaving me with nothing solid to stand on and no clear path toward reclaiming what had been stolen from me. The moment of absolute devastating clarity arrived, like lightning, splitting open a dark sky, illuminating a landscape I had never wanted to see. It happened on what had started as an ordinary afternoon during another session of the elaborate theater that had become my daily existence when my daughter-in-law made a mistake that would forever change my understanding of the depths of their deception. She had grown tired, perhaps even careless, after months of maintaining the exhausting charade of caring for a confused old woman whose persistent, subtle questions seemed to multiply like weeds, no matter how often they were deflected or dismissed. The constant vigilance required to maintain such an elaborate fiction had clearly begun to wear on her, and in a moment of frustration or simple human error, she carelessly dropped a small, neatly typed document onto the coffee table where I could see it clearly. My hands trembling with a mixture of dread and desperate curiosity, I reached for the paper that would confirm my worst fears about the nightmare I had been living. It was a detailed script formatted like a stage production with bullet points outlining Camille's memories in clinical business-like language that reduced the supposed story of my life to nothing more than talking points for actors to memorize and perform. The document contained specific anecdotes I was supposed to have shared with these hired friends, complete with names of people I had supposedly known, intimately emotional reactions I should display when certain topics were mentioned, and even fabricated secrets from my past that were designed to make their lies seem more authentic and believable. My name, my entire existence, everything I had ever been or thought or felt had been reduced to a script for hired performers to study and execute with convincing emotion. This wasn't the product of confusion or misunderstanding. This was real, tangible evidence of a conspiracy so elaborate and cold-blooded that it took my breath away with its calculated cruelty. As I held that damning document in my shaking hands, watching the words blur through tears of rage and devastation, I finally understood the full scope of what had been done to me. My entire life had become a performance, a carefully choreographed play in which I was simultaneously the unwitting star and the primary victim, a horrifying testament to how completely my existence had been stolen and replaced with a fabricated version designed to serve their purposes. The truth now revealed in all its ugly completeness was beyond anything I could have imagined, even in my darkest moments of suspicion. My son and his wife had meticulously, cold-bloodedly constructed an entirely false life for me, systematically rewriting my history, discrediting my authentic past, and isolating me from every genuine connection I had ever made, all to gain undisputed control of the assets I had spent a lifetime accumulating. This wasn't simple theft or even ordinary elder abuse. It was a crime against identity itself, a betrayal so profound and comprehensive that it severed every last thread of trust or hope I might have harbored for any kind of redemption or explanation that could make sense of their actions. There was no misunderstanding here, no room for charitable interpretation, or the possibility that their motives might have been misguided, but essentially loving. This was pure calculating evil, a chilling, premeditated act of avarice and depravity that had been designed from the beginning to transform me from an independent human being into a compliant puppet, living a stolen, borrowed existence that served their financial interests while destroying everything that had ever made me who I was. Later that same day, as my daughter-in-law launched into yet another fabricated childhood memory, from the script speaking with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who had rehearsed these lies until they sounded almost natural, I made a decision that terrified me, even as I acted on it. I looked directly into her eyes, holding the crumpled evidence of their deception in my trembling hand like a weapon. "This isn't my life," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but carrying the weight of absolute certainty that had been building within me for months. "This is a play, and I am your puppet." The words hung in the air between us like an accusation that could not be taken back or ignored. For just a moment, her carefully constructed mask slipped completely, and I saw something cold and reptilian in her expression, a glimpse of the predator that had been hiding behind the facade of the caring daughter-in-law. "Mom, you're not making sense," she said, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining her performance, even as her eyes blazed with barely contained fury at having been exposed. "You know how confused you get sometimes. Maybe we should call Dr. Peterson to adjust your medication." My son, who had been nervously hovering nearby throughout this exchange, refused to meet my gaze, his obvious discomfort and guilt written across his features as clearly as if he had confessed his crimes aloud. His inability to look at me, to defend either himself or his wife against my accusation, was perhaps the most devastating confirmation of all. Their denial, their immediate move to gaslight me, even when confronted with irrefutable evidence of their deception, served as a silent but devastating confirmation of everything I had suspected and feared. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with honest conversation. This was a deliberate, ongoing assault on my reality that would continue regardless of what I knew or suspected about their true nature. The confrontation felt like a battle between souls rather than a mere exchange of words, a moment when all pretense fell away and we faced each other as what we really were, victim and victimizers, the destroyed and the destroyer's love betrayed by greed, so complete it had erased every trace of family feeling or basic human compassion. It left me simultaneously shattered and certain devastated by the confirmation of my worst fears, but also strangely relieved to finally know beyond any doubt that my instincts had been correct, that I wasn't losing my mind, but rather discovering the horrifying truth about people I had trusted with my life and legacy. Their reaction to my moment of clarity solidified my understanding that they were beyond any possibility of redemption explanation or appeal to basic human decency. Their malice wasn't the product of desperation or unfortunate circumstances. It was a fundamental part of their character, a coldness so complete that it remained constant even when directly confronted with the suffering they had caused. The malice I had sensed remained exactly as it had always been, carefully cloaked in sweet words and false concern when others were present, but revealing itself as raw venom whenever they felt safe to drop their masks in my presence. The fabricated life they had constructed around me continued more oppressively than ever, with them doubling down on their gaslighting tactics and subtly intensifying their control as if to punish me for my momentary clarity. They began watching me more carefully, monitoring my reactions and responses with the vigilance of guards who suspected their prisoner might be planning an escape. The actors who played my friends seemed to receive new instructions, their performances becoming more elaborate and intrusive, their visits more frequent and overwhelming, as if they were trying to drown out any remaining connection I might have to my authentic memories. I realized with crushing finality that true emotional closure, genuine justice from the people who had destroyed my life, was an impossible dream that would never be fulfilled. They had committed the perfect crime, one that used my own love and trust against me, while making me appear to be the unreliable narrator of my own suffering. My heart ached with a chilling sense of permanent estrangement that went far beyond my separation from my true past and authentic memories. I was estranged from the very concept of family itself, from the basic human bonds that should have protected and nurtured me, but had instead been corrupted into weapons used for my destruction. The people who should have been my greatest protectors had become my captors, and the home that should have been my sanctuary had become my prison. This wasn't just theft. It was a form of murder, the systematic killing of everything I had ever been while keeping my body alive to serve their financial purposes. I now carried the full, crushing weight of this terrifying truth, like a physical burden that pressed down on my chest and made every breath an effort. My identity had been stolen so completely that I barely recognized myself in mirrors. My life fabricated so thoroughly that I questioned whether the woman I remembered being had ever truly existed. My past rewritten so systematically that authentic memories felt like fragments of someone else's dreams. This truth was too monstrous to share with anyone too unbelievable to voice, without sounding like the confused ramblings of an elderly woman whose mind had been damaged by stroke and further compromised by psychological manipulation. Who would believe such an elaborate conspiracy coming from someone who had already been systematically discredited, stripped of credibility and social connections by the very people she was accusing? Any attempt to expose their crimes would be met with sympathetic head shaking and gentle suggestions that I needed better medical care for my obviously deteriorating mental condition. They had built their deception so carefully, created such a comprehensive narrative of my supposed cognitive decline, that my own testimony against them would only serve as further evidence of how desperately I needed their help and protection. The thought of attempting to fight back through legal channels or public exposure filled me with a terror so complete it made my hands shake and my heart race. It would only lead to further isolation, perhaps even forced institutionalization in some sterile facility where I would spend my remaining years drugged into compliance while they enjoyed the wealth they had stolen from me. The secret of what they had done burned like a coal in my heart, heavy and isolating, creating a constant reminder that I was living a borrowed life in a fabricated world where nothing was real except the love I still felt for the son who had betrayed me so completely. The weight of this knowledge was crushing, but sharing it would only make my situation infinitely worse. Standing alone in the bedroom that wasn't really mine, surrounded by furniture and photographs that told the story of a life I had never lived, I found myself at the most desolate crossroads a human being can face. The choice before me would determine how I spent whatever years remained to me, and neither option offered anything resembling hope or justice or redemption. To fight for external justice, to expose their crimes, and attempt to reclaim my assets and authentic identity through legal means would require a strength and credibility I simply no longer possessed. It would mean waging a public battle. I was far too frail and isolated to win fighting against enemies who had already demonstrated their willingness to use my own vulnerability, my stroke-induced confusion, as weapons against me. They had spent months, perhaps years, preparing for exactly this possibility, building a fortress of lies so complete that any attempt to scale its walls would result in my own destruction. They had witnesses, documentation, medical records, and a carefully constructed narrative that painted me as an unreliable narrator whose own family was heroically caring for her despite her increasingly difficult behavior. The alternative path stretched before me like a descent into a different kind of hell, accepting my powerlessness, choosing internal survival over external justice, retreating into whatever fortress of authenticity I could build within my own mind, while allowing their deception to continue unchallenged in the outside world. This wasn't surrender, though it would appear that way to any observer. It was a form of strategic retreat, a recognition that some battles cannot be won through direct confrontation when the enemy holds all the advantages and the victim has been systematically stripped of every resource that might level the playing field. with a deep, shuddering breath that felt like it might be one of my last. As the woman I had always believed myself to be, I made the decision that would define whatever remained of my existence. It was born not of surrender to their evil, though I knew that's how they would interpret it, but of grim necessity and the overwhelming weariness that comes from fighting a war you cannot possibly win. I would not pursue external justice or attempt to expose their crimes to a world that had already been convinced of my unreliability. My failing health, both physical and mental, demanded a different kind of strategy, a retreat into internal resilience that might allow me to preserve whatever fragments of my authentic self could survive in the hostile environment they had created around me. It was a painful acknowledgement of powerlessness, a recognition that some battles, however righteous and necessary they might be, cannot be won by confronting the enemy head-on when one has been left so utterly vulnerable and defenseless. My focus would shift from fighting them to simply surviving them, from trying to reclaim my stolen life to protecting whatever remained of my true self from complete erasure. This decision brought with it a kind of terrible peace, the relief that comes from finally accepting a reality too painful to continue fighting against. I would endure rather than resist, preserve rather than reclaim, survive rather than overcome. It wasn't the ending I had hoped for, but it was the only one that offered any possibility of maintaining my sanity and dignity. My son and his wife, completely oblivious to the profound internal clarity I had achieved about their true nature, continued to thrive in the outside world with a brazenness that took my breath away. They used my stolen wealth to buy new properties, making investments with money that represented my life's work while presenting themselves to the world as successful, caring family members who had made sacrifices to care for an aging relative. They hosted lavish parties in homes purchased with my assets, their smiles wider and more confident than ever, their facade more polished and convincing with each passing day. The hired imposters who continued to play my friends attended these social events, creating a chilling testament to how completely they had succeeded in rewriting not just my personal reality, but my entire social existence. The painful dichotomy between their obvious prosperity and my internal agony was a daily reminder of how indifferent the world could be to hidden cruelty, how easily society celebrated those who succeeded while remaining blind to the suffering of their victims. They were living my dreams with my money, while I withered in the gilded cage they had constructed for me. This contrast highlighted something fundamental about human nature that I had never wanted to understand, that evil often thrives precisely because it presents such an attractive surface to the world, while its victims suffer in silence and isolation, their cries for help dismissed as the confused ramblings of minds that can no longer be trusted. That evening, after making my terrible decision to abandon any hope of external justice, I allowed myself one small act of defiance that they could never detect or prevent. I retrieved my precious locket, the tiny photograph of my real home's view pressed against my thumb like a talisman that connected me to everything they had tried to steal. I didn't try to recall the specific details of that beloved vista or torture myself with memories of the life I had lost. Instead, I simply felt the texture of the photograph, absorbed its silent truth, let it remind me that somewhere beneath all their lies and manipulation, the real Camille still existed, however buried and battered she might be. It was a small, quiet act of self-preservation, a personal vow to hold on to my essential self, even if I could no longer fight to reclaim my external circumstances. Then I hummed a fragment of an old lullaby, one that only my true mother had ever sung, a soft, private melody of love and enduring identity that served as my declaration of quiet, internal resistance against total erasure. These tiny acts of rebellion, invisible to my captors, but profound in their meaning to me, became my way of embracing whatever remained of my authentic self, while accepting that the external battle was lost beyond any hope of recovery. My days evolved into a delicate internal dance, a subtle navigation through the treacherous landscape of their fabricated reality that required all my remaining strength and wisdom to survive with any fragment of my authentic self intact. I had learned to move through their world like a ghost present enough to avoid suspicion, but internally withdrawn to protect whatever core of truth I could still access. I found unexpected solace in quiet, intensely private moments that they couldn't control or monitor, tiny sanctuaries of peace that existed in the spaces between their surveillance and manipulation. Most precious of all was the small sprig of gardenia I had managed to secretly cultivate in a tiny pot hidden behind a stack of books they had provided as part of my false reading history. The distinctive, intoxicating scent of those delicate white blossoms served as a powerful anchor to my true home, transporting me instantly back to mornings when I would wake to that beloved fragrance drifting through my real bedroom window. Tending to this hidden plant became an act of quiet rebellion against the spiritual decay they had imposed on every other aspect of my existence, a living symbol of my refusal to let them kill everything beautiful in my world. I spent hours simply listening to the distant sounds outside the windows of this house that was supposed to be my home, but felt like an elaborate stage set. The rhythm of traffic in the morning, the calls of birds. I couldn't see the voices of neighbors living authentic lives just beyond the walls of my fabricated existence. These ordinary sounds became meditation anchors that connected me to a world they couldn't completely control. These weren't grand acts of escape or resistance that might attract their attention and bring down new forms of punishment on my head. They were tiny, desperate measures to preserve my inner world, creating a hidden sanctuary against their lies that existed in the private spaces of my mind and heart, where their manufactured reality couldn't quite reach. The simple act of breathing deeply while listening to real sounds from the authentic world outside became a form of prayer, a way of reminding myself that life continued beyond the boundaries of their deception, that somewhere people were living genuine lives filled with real relationships and authentic experiences. Human connection had become almost impossibly rare in my isolated existence, but when it did occur, it felt more precious than gold, more vital than air. The young home health aide named Sarah, who visited twice a week, seemed to possess an intuitive understanding that went beyond her professional training, an ability to see past my sometimes muddled words to the silent anguish that lived behind my eyes. Sarah never pressed me for explanations or tried to correct what others might have seen as confused ramblings. Instead, she would offer a gentle touch on my shoulder, a warm smile that carried no agenda moments of shared silence that felt unburdened by the need to perform or pretend or conform to someone else's version of who I was supposed to be. Even the brief interactions with delivery people took on profound significance in my starved emotional landscape. A friendly nod from the postal worker, a genuine smile from someone bringing groceries. These fleeting acknowledgments of my existence became lifelines that reminded me I was still visible to the outside world, still real, despite their systematic attempts to erase my authentic identity. These people weren't confidants in any traditional sense. I could never risk sharing the truth of my situation with them, knowing it would only result in my being labeled as confused or delusional. But they were external validations, that I was still seen, still recognized as a human being, worthy of basic courtesy and kindness, providing fragile connections to the world of genuine human interaction that existed beyond the walls of my psychological prison. The hunger for authentic human contact had become so intense that even these minimal interactions felt like glimpses of water to someone dying of thirst. They reminded me that compassion still existed in the world, that not everyone was capable of the systematic cruelty I was experiencing within my own family. I began engaging in a secret creative practice that became my most important form of internal rebellion and self-preservation. Using a dull pencil I had hidden away, I started sketching on the blank pages at the back of an old discarded book that had been part of their carefully curated false library, drawing fragments of my true life that emerged from deep within my damaged but persistent memory. The unique curve of my mother's smile materialized on the page as my fingers moved almost without conscious direction, muscle memory guiding the pencil to recreate features I had loved and lost. The familiar lines of my favorite armchair from my real home took shape, every detail of its worn upholstery and comfortable proportions, captured with an accuracy that proved these memories were authentic, not fabricated. The precise layout of my actual garden revealed itself through these secret drawings, each plant and pathway emerging with a clarity that no amount of gaslighting could obscure. These sketches became a meticulous internal act of remembrance, a desperate effort to keep my true identity alive, however fragmented it might have become. This hidden artistic practice served as my anchor in the storm of confusion they had created around me, a way of proving to myself that the woman I remembered being had indeed existed, that my authentic memories were real and valuable, despite their systematic attempts to replace them with fabricated alternatives. Each drawing was an act of defiance. They could never detect a silent declaration that they had not succeeded in completely erasing the person I had spent 70 years becoming. The act of creation itself became a form of prayer, a way of communing with my authentic self and preserving something essential that existed beyond their reach. Yet even these small victories against complete erasure were shadowed by the constant oppressive presence of their deception. The hired friends continued their regular visits, their performances becoming more elaborate and intrusive, as if they sensed my growing internal resistance and were determined to overwhelm it with sheer volume of fabricated experiences. My son and his wife maintained their facade of loving concern with a persistence that was both impressive and terrifying, their superficial charm mixed with an underlying wrongness that made my skin crawl every time they entered the room. Their concern for my well-being had become a constant weapon wielded with surgical precision to reinforce my vulnerability and dependence on their version of reality. The subtle gaslighting continued relentlessly, a psychological torture so sophisticated that it required no physical violence or obvious abuse to achieve its devastating effects. Every conversation was carefully designed to erode my confidence in my own perceptions, every interaction crafted to remind me that without their help, I would be lost and helpless in a world too complex for my damaged mind to navigate. Their shadow lingered over every moment of peace I managed to create, ensuring that the deep, aching wound of my stolen identity never had a chance to heal completely. The question of, who am I, remained a constant thrum in the background of my consciousness, a painful reminder that my entire sense of self had been systematically dismantled and replaced with something foreign and false. The knowledge that they continued to prosper while I struggled to maintain basic sanity was a daily torment that colored every small victory with the bitter taste of ongoing injustice. But I had learned to find meaning in endurance itself, to locate dignity in survival rather than triumph, to build whatever peace was possible within the constraints of an impossible situation. The triggering moment arrived without warning during what had seemed like an ordinary evening of enforced social interaction, shattering the fragile emotional equilibrium I had been carefully constructing in my internal world. One of the hired friends was recounting yet another fabricated story from my supposed past, this time describing wild adventures from my youth that bore no resemblance to the quiet, studious young woman I actually remembered being. As this skilled actor painted vivid pictures of parties I had never attended and romantic escapades I had never experienced, speaking with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who had memorized these lies until they sounded almost believable, a sudden, intensely powerful memory flared within my consciousness like lightning illuminating a dark landscape. It wasn't a memory of their false narrative, but something infinitely more precious and real, a specific private moment of profound joy I had shared with my true best friend decades ago, laughing together until tears streamed down our faces over some silly joke that had sent us into fits of uncontrollable giggles that lasted for what felt like hours. The stark contrast between the fabricated story being performed for my benefit and the vibrant truth of my own authentic memory was so jarring that it felt like a physical blow to my chest. The falsity of their narrative versus the vivid reality of my internal experience ignited a searing, immediate resurgence of the profound loss I carried every moment, but usually managed to keep buried beneath the surface of my daily survival. This wasn't simply sadness or the gentle melancholy that comes with aging and the natural passing of time. This was a raw, physical ache that emanated from the deepest parts of my soul, a grief so intense it felt like my heart was being torn from my chest while I remained conscious to experience every moment of the agony. I was mourning, not just the loss of my friend or the passage of years, but the desecration of something sacred, the way my most precious memories had been twisted into weapons used against me by people who should have cherished and protected them. The theft wasn't just financial, it was spiritual, a violation of everything that had ever made my life meaningful or beautiful. Unable to maintain the pretense of enjoying their performance any longer, I retreated into the deepest corners of my mind, allowing myself to sink beneath the waves of sorrow that had been building for months, but had never been fully acknowledged or released. In the privacy of my internal sanctuary, I finally gave myself permission to feel the full weight of what had been done to me. Tears streamed down my face in an endless flow of grief that encompassed not just my current situation, but the accumulated losses of a lifetime, all made infinitely more painful by the knowledge that they had been weaponized against me. I wept for my stolen identity, for the authentic relationships that had been severed, for the trust that had been shattered so completely it could never be repaired. This wasn't a moment of weakness or breakdown, though anyone observing might have interpreted it that way. It was a raw, necessary outpouring of the soul-crushing despair I had been carrying in silence for so long, an acknowledgement that some wounds, especially those involving such profound deception and the systematic theft of one's very identity, never fully heal. The grief wasn't something to be overcome or resolved through time or therapy or positive thinking. It was a permanent feature of the landscape of my life, now a constant companion that would sometimes retreat into the background, but would never entirely disappear. Some forms of betrayal leave scars so deep they become part of the architecture of the soul. In my overwhelming need for some form of human connection and validation during one of Sarah's regular visits, my carefully maintained defenses finally cracked just enough to allow a few fragments of truth to escape. The words emerged from somewhere beyond my conscious control, whispered confessions that I hadn't planned to make but couldn't seem to stop. They stole my life, Sarah. I found myself saying, my voice barely audible, but carrying the weight of months of suppressed agony. Not just money, my memories, my very self. I gestured vaguely at the surroundings that were supposed to represent my home, but felt like an elaborate movie set designed to drive me insane. Sarah's eyes filled with a depth of understanding that went far beyond her professional training, met mine without flinching or looking away. There was no judgment in her expression, no dismissal of my words as the confused ramblings of a damaged mind. She simply nodded with quiet certainty, offering the kind of unspoken validation I hadn't received in longer than I could remember. "That's a terrible thing, Camille," she said softly, using my real name with the respect and dignity that had been missing from my life for so long. "But you're still here. The real you is still here, no matter what they've tried to take away." In that moment of shared silent vulnerability, a tiny crack appeared in the wall of isolation that had been suffocating me for months. It wasn't about finding solutions or planning strategies for escape. It was about being seen and believed by another human being, about having my reality acknowledged as valid and important, despite what others might say about my mental state. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt less alone with the weight of what I carried. Sarah didn't need to know all the details of their elaborate deception to understand the essential truth that I was a human being whose identity had been stolen, whose suffering was real and valid, whose voice deserved to be heard, even if the world had been convinced not to believe it. Later that week, observing my son and daughter-in-law during one of their lavish parties hosted with my stolen wealth, I found myself studying them with the detached fascination of an anthropologist observing an alien species. Their charm, so effective in convincing their guests of their success and respectability, seemed increasingly brittle and artificial to my educated eye. Their laughter never quite reached their eyes, carrying an undertone of desperation that suggested they were performing not just for others, but for themselves, trying to convince themselves that their hollow victory was worth the price they had paid for it. There was a subtle but unmistakable tension in their forced smiles, a quality that reminded me of actors who had been playing the same role for so long they had forgotten who they really were underneath the performance. While the world saw their apparent happiness and success, celebrated their apparent prosperity and charitable nature, I could see the empty core that fueled their insatiable avarice, the gnawing dissatisfaction that made no amount of stolen wealth sufficient to fill the void where their consciences should have been. Their happiness, built entirely on the foundation of my destroyed life, was ultimately a hollow victory that would never bring them genuine peace or satisfaction, because it was rooted in destruction rather than creation, in theft rather than honest achievement, in cruelty rather than love. The true cost of their depravity was becoming visible in their desperate need for external validation, their constant hunger for more wealth and status and recognition that could never quite satisfy the emptiness they had created within themselves through their systematic destruction of everything that should have mattered most to them. During one of my solitary moments of secret sketching When I was carefully adding details to a drawing of my mother's garden that existed only in my authentic memories, I found my attention drawn to the view outside my window. There stood an old, magnificently resilient tree that had somehow escaped my notice during all the months I had been trapped in this fabricated reality. The tree was clearly ancient, its thick trunk scarred by decades of storms and seasons, its roots running so deep into the earth that no surface disturbance could threaten its fundamental stability. Despite the obvious damage it had endured over the years, its branches continued to reach upward toward the light, with an unwavering determination that spoke of something indestructible in its essential nature. As I watched the interplay of light and shadow across its weathered bark, it struck me with sudden, overwhelming clarity that life in its grand and mysterious design often mirrors exactly this kind of struggle. There are unseen forces of destruction constantly at work, attempting to uproot and devastate everything we hold dear. Yet there is also an inherent unstoppable drive within all living things to persist, to maintain their core identity despite every assault upon their existence. My personal torment, while devastating and all-consuming from my limited perspective, was actually part of this larger universal human experience that had been playing out since the beginning of time. The fragility of truth in a world that often rewards deception, the insidious nature of those who prey upon the vulnerable, the enduring power of a spirit that clings to its authentic self, even when everything external has been stripped away. These were not unique to my story, but were threads in the vast tapestry of human existence. This realization didn't diminish the reality of my suffering or make my losses any less significant, but it placed them in a context that somehow made them more bearable. I was part of an ancient tradition of souls who had faced unimaginable betrayal and somehow found ways to preserve their essential selves despite every attempt to erase them. The tree outside my window was both my teacher and my companion in this struggle. That evening, sitting alone in my room while holding my precious locket close to my heart, I made a conscious, deliberate choice that would change the fundamental nature of my relationship with the nightmare I was living. I chose to release the desperate, consuming need that had been torturing me for months. The need to fully understand why my own son could betray me so utterly, why his wife possessed such calculated, complete cruelty. I had spent countless sleepless nights trying to find rational explanations for the irrational evil I was experiencing, searching my memories for some sign I had missed, some warning that could have prepared me for this level of betrayal from the people I had loved and trusted most completely. I had driven myself to the edge of madness, trying to understand how human beings could systematically destroy someone who had devoted her life to their welfare. But sitting there in the gentle lamplight, surrounded by the false artifacts of a life I had never lived, I finally accepted that some questions about human depravity, about the complete systematic erasure of another person's identity for financial gain, might simply never have answers that could satisfy my need for understanding. Some darkness in the human soul runs deeper than logic or empathy, can reach some forms of evil, exist beyond the boundaries of what loving hearts can comprehend. The why of their cruelty was ultimately less important than the how of my survival, less relevant than my ability to preserve whatever fragments of my authentic self I could protect from their ongoing assault. In that moment of surrender, in finally letting go of the need for perfect comprehension, a fragile but genuine sense of peace began to settle over me like a warm blanket on a cold night. This wasn't the peace of resolution or justice served, but something deeper and more lasting. The peace that comes from accepting the limits of human understanding and finding meaning not in answers, but in the very act of enduring with dignity intact. This was an act of profound wisdom that had taken me 7 decades and unimaginable suffering to learn this acceptance that not all mysteries are meant to be solved, not all wounds are meant to heal completely, and that some burdens are simply to be carried with whatever grace and quiet dignity we can muster while clinging to our own truth, however fragmented it might become. I found myself discovering a deep, fragile peace that existed not in escape or dramatic resolution, but in the simple, profound act of enduring while holding on to my essential truth, however solitary and embattled that truth had become. My life was profoundly imperfect, stolen, and systematically distorted by people who should have protected it. But my inner world, my true memories, my fundamental essence remained mine in ways they could never touch or claim. The confusion that clouded my daily existence lingered like morning fog, and the sorrow remained a constant dull ache that colored every experience with melancholy. But these painful realities no longer consumed me entirely or threatened to drown me in despair as they had in the early days of my awakening to their deception. This imperfect peace, forged in the crucible of psychological agony and tempered by months of learning to survive in hostile territory, was a testament to something indestructible in the human spirit. It was proof of our tenacious will to preserve our essential selves, even when justice feels unattainable, even when we're forced to live within a constant, terrifying lie that threatens to swallow everything we've ever been. The peace I had found wasn't dependent on external circumstances or the possibility of future vindication. It was rooted in something deeper than situation or outcome, the recognition that my worth as a human being didn't depend on their acknowledgement of my reality, that my truth didn't require their validation to remain real and meaningful. While their physical presence remained as oppressive as ever, their elaborate deception continuing to surround me like an invisible prison, I began to notice that their insidious power over my internal world was starting to diminish in subtle but significant ways. The constant psychological manipulation that had once threatened to drive me completely insane was beginning to lose its ability to make me doubt the fundamental reality of my own existence. Their gaslighting words, though persistent and delivered with the same calculated precision as always, no longer held the power to make me question my sanity or the validity of my memories. I had learned to recognize their tactics for what they were, weapons designed to confuse and control, rather than expressions of genuine concern for my well-being. I was gradually learning to create and maintain an internal sanctuary, a protected space within my mind and heart, where their manufactured reality could not fully penetrate, where the truth of who I really was could exist safely beyond their reach. This sanctuary wasn't perfect or completely secure, but it was mine, built from the materials of authentic memory and genuine self-knowledge that no amount of external manipulation could entirely destroy. Their grip on my sanity, while not completely broken, was definitely loosening with each day that I proved to myself that I could survive their worst efforts to erase me. What had once felt like an iron cage was becoming more like a shadow that followed me but could no longer define the totality of my existence. This gradual liberation was perhaps the most important victory I could claim. Not the dramatic triumph of justice served or family restored, but the quiet, persistent triumph of refusing to let evil have the final word in determining who I was or what my life meant. Their influence was becoming a fading shadow in the landscape of my profound, hard-won endurance, a testament to the enduring whispers of my stolen, but not destroyed, authentic life. The encounter came without warning during what they called a special family outing, one of their periodic attempts to create new fabricated memories while reinforcing their narrative of being the devoted caregivers of a confused but beloved elderly relative. They had decided to take me to a local art gallery, probably calculating that the cultural setting would provide new opportunities for creating false stories about my supposed artistic interests and past creative pursuits. As we moved through the gallery's quiet halls, my son and daughter-in-law keeping careful watch over my reactions while maintaining their performance of loving family members enjoying a pleasant afternoon together, I found myself drawn to a particular painting that seemed to call out to something deep within my authentic consciousness. It was an abstract work, but powerfully evocative in ways that transcended its lack of literal representation. The painting depicted a gnarled ancient tree with only a few vibrant green leaves clinging to its weathered branches, the entire image surrounded by a swirling, indistinct fog that seemed to blur and obscure everything except the tree's essential form. Standing before this canvas felt like looking into a mirror that reflected not my physical appearance, but the true state of my soul. Here was a perfect silent representation of my own fragmented existence, the enduring truth of who I really was, still clinging to life amidst the blurring lies and manufactured confusion that had been wrapped around me like suffocating fog. The tree in the painting stood with the same stubborn dignity I had been fighting to maintain its few remaining leaves, a testament to the possibility of authentic life persisting even in the most hostile environments. The fog that surrounded it was beautiful in its own way, but also clearly artificial, a distortion that obscured rather than revealed the truth of what lay beneath its swirling surface. As I stood transfixed by this unexpected encounter with a visual representation of my own struggle, my son and daughter-in-law approached with their usual casual confidence, ready to incorporate even this spontaneous moment into their elaborate construction of false history. "Do you remember painting something like this, Mom?" my daughter-in-law asked with perfectly calibrated warmth and encouragement. "You were quite the artist back in your younger days. This style is very similar to some of your early work." Her words meant to reinforce their fabricated version of my past, while creating new false memories for future reference, simply underscored the breathtaking depth of their deception. They were so committed to their lie that they couldn't allow even a moment of genuine experience to exist without being immediately claimed and distorted for their purposes. The casual ease with which she attempted to steal even my reaction to this painting, to turn my authentic emotional response into another building block in their structure of lies, was a chilling echo of how completely they had colonized every aspect of my existence. Nothing was allowed to be simply real. Everything had to serve their narrative of the confused old woman whose actual history was whatever they decided it should be. This brief encounter with the painting and their immediate attempt to claim it as part of their fabrication didn't ignite the rage I might have expected, the fury that had once consumed me when I first began to understand the scope of their deception. Instead, it brought a complex, profound ache that seemed to encompass not just my current situation, but the entire tragedy of human existence in a world where such calculated cruelty was possible. It was a searing reminder of everything authentic that had been stolen from me, all the genuine experiences and relationships and memories that had been systematically replaced with their carefully constructed alternatives. The painting represented not just what I had lost, but what I was still fighting to preserve, that core of authentic selfhood that persisted despite every attempt to erase it. The encounter brought back all the what-if questions that haunted my quieter moments, the endless speculation about whether I could ever escape this prison of lies, whether there was any path back to a life based on truth rather than elaborate fiction. The sight of that tree clinging to life despite the fog that surrounded it filled me with both hope and despair. Hope that survival was possible, despair that survival might be all that was possible. The pain of my stolen identity was indeed duller now than it had been in those first devastating weeks of recognition worn smooth by months of constant pressure, until it had become a manageable ache rather than a sharp agony. But the echo of that loss persisted like a low note that continues to vibrate long after the instrument has been silenced, a deep, visceral sense of an unfinished narrative that would never have a satisfying conclusion. My first desperate instinct upon seeing that painting was to scream to expose them right there in the gallery, full of cultured strangers, to point at the artwork and cry out, "This is my truth. This is what they've done to me." I wanted to tear away their masks in public, to force the world to see the predators hiding behind their facade of family devotion. But even as the impulse rose in my throat, the memory of their gaslighting, their insidious control, their systematic destruction of my credibility flooded through me like ice water. I knew with painful certainty that such an outburst would be futile, perhaps even dangerous, leading only to further confinement and new restrictions on what little freedom I had managed to preserve. Any dramatic public confrontation would only provide them with more evidence of my deteriorating mental state, more justification for their reluctant decisions to limit my independence and increase their control over every aspect of my existence. The very people who had created my agony would be celebrated for their patience in dealing with my difficult behavior. So I simply stood there, allowing the painting's silent truth to wash over me and settle into my bones, absorbing its message of endurance and authenticity before slowly, deliberately allowing myself to be guided away from this unexpected moment of recognition and validation. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no neat resolution that would satisfy my need for justice or provide closure to this ongoing tragedy. My choice, as it had been from the beginning, was to endure to continue my quiet struggle for meaning and dignity while accepting that true closure sometimes meant embracing its devastating absence. I made this choice not because I had given up hope entirely, but because I understood that preserving my fragile sanity and holding on to whatever remained of my true self was more important than any temporary satisfaction that might come from a futile gesture of defiance. My steps felt heavy and deliberate as I allowed myself to be led away from the gallery and back toward the car that would return me to my beautiful prison. My path forward remained clear, even though it would be forever marked by this indelible sorrow, this haunting reminder of what might have been possible in a world where truth was valued more than convenience. I carried my hard-won strength and quiet wisdom with me, but I also carried the enduring scars of my helplessness, the pervasive ache of a life stolen and replaced with something hollow and false. The fabricated existence would continue flowing like a dark, unresolved current beneath the surface of whatever peace I managed to create. My journey was continuing, but not toward any kind of happy ending that would restore what had been lost or punish those who deserved punishment. Instead, I was moving toward a profound, agonizing understanding of what it meant to maintain authentic selfhood in the face of unspeakable cruelty to preserve essential humanity when surrounded by those who saw me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited until nothing remained. One quiet night, several weeks after the devastating encounter at the art gallery, I sat alone in the room that was supposed to be mine, but felt like an elaborate stage set, holding my precious locket in hands that no longer trembled with rage or desperation, but had found a different kind of steadiness, born from acceptance of what could not be changed. The house around me was silent, except for the distant sounds of my captors, sleeping peacefully in beds purchased with my stolen wealth, their dreams presumably untroubled by guilt or conscience. In this profound solitude, surrounded by the artifacts of a life I had never lived, I experienced something I can only describe as a moment of ultimate internal clarity that seemed to emanate from a source deeper than rational thought. This clarity wasn't about finding answers to the questions that had tormented me for so long: why such calculated evil had consumed the people who should have loved me most, why they had chosen avarice over family bonds, why my entire existence had been deemed expendable in service of their financial ambitions. Those questions still existed, but they no longer held the power to drive me toward madness with their unanswered persistence. Instead, this profound understanding was about achieving a state of acceptance that transcended my desperate need for solutions, explanations, or justice. It was a deep, sorrowful peace, born not of resolution, but of finally comprehending something fundamental about the tragic nature of human existence, the deep flaws that exist in our species, and the terrifying power that lies within the manipulation of memory and identity. I was finally beginning to grasp that some of life's most painful mysteries exist beyond the reach of rational explanation, that there are forms of human cruelty so complete and systematic that they defy every attempt to understand their origins or motivations. The why of my suffering was ultimately less important than the how of my endurance, less relevant than my ability to preserve whatever core of authenticity remained accessible to me. I consciously embraced the humbling realization that some of life's deepest questions, especially those involving the deliberate theft of identity and the systematic manipulation of the vulnerable, may never have explanations that satisfy our human need for understanding and closure. This acceptance wasn't a surrender to despair or abandonment of hope for meaning in existence, but rather a profound act of wisdom that had been decades in the making. It was a letting go of the illusion that we can control or comprehend every aspect of our experience, a recognition that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, not because they lack answers, but because the answers exist in realms beyond our current capacity for understanding. My comprehension of the human condition had deepened through these months of suffering, leading me to acknowledge that such darkness exists as a fundamental reality in our world. Sometimes, the only path to any kind of peace is to accept the presence of evil without feeling compelled to fully comprehend its source or purpose, to find strength not in fighting against what cannot be changed, but in preserving what can be protected. The battle wasn't about defeating them or exposing their crimes to a world that had already been convinced of my unreliability. It was about holding on to the truth that remained within me, however fragmented and embattled that truth had become. This philosophical shift was subtle, but fundamental, changing not what I experienced, but how I related to that experience. Instead of measuring my worth by what I had been unable to prevent or achieve, I was learning to find meaning in the very act of surviving, with my essential humanity intact, of refusing to let their cruelty transform me into something as empty and hollow as they had become. With a gentle, almost imperceptible sigh that seemed to release something I had been holding too tightly for far too long, I closed my eyes and performed a subtle internal act of letting go that felt like setting down a burden I hadn't realized was still weighing me down. It was like opening my hands and allowing the last of my desperate need for external validation to flow away like water. This was a silent prayer, not for the miraculous escape that would restore my previous life, or the dramatic intervention that would punish those who had destroyed it, but for the continued strength to keep living with purpose and dignity while bearing witness to both the beauty and the horror that existed in human nature. I was asking not for freedom from my circumstances, but for the wisdom to find meaning within them. I felt a profound sense of liberation in the very act of learning to live with the lingering question, recognizing that this agonizing ambiguity about justice and resolution was now an integral part of my story, but no longer its complete definition. The uncertainty about whether I would ever see my tormentors held accountable the unresolved nature of my stolen past, the ongoing prosperity of those who had caused such devastation. These painful realities no longer had the power to define the totality of my existence. I had discovered a form of freedom that I never could have imagined in the early days of recognizing my situation. Not freedom from pain, which continued to be a daily reality, but freedom within pain, the ability to experience suffering without being completely consumed by it. This was an internal victory of the spirit that no external circumstances could take away from me, a triumph that existed independent of what others might think or do. The story of my life, though, marked by betrayal so profound, it challenged my understanding of what family bonds were supposed to mean, had not succeeded in breaking the essential core of who I was. The people who had set out to erase my identity and replace it with something that served their purposes had failed in their ultimate objective, because they had only been able to touch the external aspects of my existence. They could steal my money, claim my property, manipulate my social connections, and even distort my daily reality. But they could not reach the deepest parts of my consciousness where my authentic self continued to exist. The woman I had spent 70 years becoming remained intact beneath all their lies and manipulations, scarred but not destroyed, wounded but not defeated. Instead of destroying me, these experiences had deepened my spirit in ways that might never have been possible under easier circumstances, transforming me into someone capable of profound empathy and quiet strength that I might never have discovered without being tested beyond what should be asked of any human being. The trials I had endured had burned away everything superficial and temporary, leaving behind something more essential and lasting. My scars were not sources of shame to be hidden, but marks of wisdom earned through genuine suffering, testaments to a soul that had endured more than should be possible and had somehow found ways to not only survive, but to continue growing in compassion and understanding. These wounds had transformed me into a living example of resilience, a quiet beacon for others who might be facing their own impossible circumstances. The profound quiet wisdom I had gained was not something that could be easily shared or explained to others, but it was real and substantial a foundation upon which I could build whatever remained of my life, regardless of external circumstances. This ultimate acceptance, this hard-won understanding of my place in the larger tapestry of human experience, carried within it a bittersweet but genuine peace that no one could steal from me. My life now exists in a space between truth and fabrication, between the authentic woman I know myself to be and the confused elderly person others have been convinced I am. It is a precarious existence balanced on the knife's edge between sanity and surrender, but it is mine, and I have learned to find meaning in that ownership, even when everything else has been stolen from me. The comfortable certainties I once took for granted, the reliability of family bonds, the security of accumulated wealth, the simple pleasure of being known and understood by those closest to me. All of these have been stripped away with surgical precision, replaced by a reality so carefully constructed that even I sometimes wonder if I am the confused old woman they claim me to be. Yet within this manufactured existence, I have discovered reserves of strength I never knew I possessed, a capacity for endurance that has surprised even me. The woman I have become through this trial by fire bears little resemblance to the person who first awoke from her stroke to find her world transformed. But she is real in ways that their fabricated version of me could never be. I am fundamentally transformed, no longer the trusting matriarch who believed that love and generosity would be naturally reciprocated by those who benefited from them. I have been educated in the darkest aspects of human nature, forced to confront the reality that some people are capable of destroying those who love them most, if it serves their immediate interests. My scars run deeper than the physical effects of the stroke that first made me vulnerable to their manipulation. They are written in the landscape of my soul, permanent markers of a journey through territory I never wanted to explore, reminders that some forms of betrayal leave wounds that transform rather than simply heal. But these marks of suffering have become paradoxically sources of wisdom and compassion that inform every moment of my continued existence. They have taught me that meaning can be found even in the most impossible circumstances, that dignity can be maintained even when everything external has been stripped away, and that the human spirit possesses reserves of endurance that defy every rational calculation about what should be survivable. Through it all, I have learned that the deepest truths about human existence often resist neat explanations or satisfying resolutions. Sometimes the people we trust most completely are the ones capable of the most devastating betrayal. Sometimes justice never comes, and evil prospers while good suffers in silence. Sometimes the only victory possible is the internal triumph of refusing to let cruelty have the final word in defining who we are. The road ahead remains unmarked by any promise of restoration or redemption, but it stretches forward nonetheless, illuminated not by hope for dramatic reversal of fortune, but by the quieter light of acceptance and the hard-won understanding that some forms of love transcend every external circumstance, enduring even when they seem to lead only to loss.